In this video, we're going to write some client-side JavaScript to make our lives a little bit easier for storing latitude and longitude. You see that I have this address field. This is the finished version that I've got up and running. And if I were to say like Paris, and it will automatically give me this like drop-down autocomplete where I can select Paris and hit enter. It's going to populate the lat and the long, or the long and the lat. And I could do things like Hamilton, Ontario, and it will give me the long and the lat. So that's extremely helpful because there's no way that I want to type in the lat and the long, and your users also don't know that. So this is called geolocation, where it's going to, you give it an address or the name of a Mulberry Coffee. That's a coffee shop around the corner from me. You just give it something that you'd normally type into Google, and then it will do sort of a reverse lookup for the lat and the long and store it in there. So that's what we want to do. And let's take a look at how client-side JavaScript is written in our course. If you open up your public folder and you open up your JavaScript folder, you're going to see this delicious-app.js. This is sort of the entry point for all of our JavaScript. This is the where Webpack is bundling them all together. And then in our modules directory is where we're going to write each of the client-side modules that will happen. So I've already included bling.js. And if you've never used it before, bling.js will just give us short form to document.querySelector and querySelector all. It will give us .on each of our nodes. So we could say like, it sort of makes it look like jQuery and a little bit nicer. So we can do things like .wrapper on click. And rather than us having to do the whole var wrapper equals document.querySelector and then wrapper.add event listener click, etc. You get the point, right? So this is just a little helper called bling.js. I modified it a little bit, but it's based on Paul Irish's thing, who's a pretty cool developer from Google, and you should check out what he's done here. So we want to make a module, and we're going to call it autocomplete. So we'll go into our modules folder and call autocomplete.js. And we're going to make a function called autocomplete that's going to take in an input, a lat input, and a long input. And from that, it's going to do the work for us and populate. Then we can export default autocomplete. So I'm using ES6 here because we do not have ES6 on Node just yet, but we do have ES6 in Webpack and the ability to compile that for us. So we have that. Then we'll go back into our delicious app right here, and we will import that. Import autocomplete from modules autocomplete. Good. So then we have this autocomplete function that we can just run. So autocomplete, and we need to pass it three things. We need to pass it our address variable, or address input, our longitude input, and our latitude input. But you'll notice here that I've done it lat and long. So opposite. Why? Because Google Maps does it the right way, and MongoDB does it the other way. So it's kind of confusing. You got to keep switching them around, but stay sharp. You'll get it. So first thing, we need to pass it the address input, pound address. So let's go to our store form.pug, and our address has an ID of address. Our long has ID of long, and our lat has an ID of lat. Good. So address. The second thing we need to pass it is the latitude. Was that right? Yep, the lat input. And the third thing we need to pass it is the longitude. Again, this is not jQuery. It looks like jQuery, but rather than us doing $, it's just saying document.querySelector. But who's got time to write that? We just do $, nice and quickly. Good. So we have that. Let's go back into our autocomplete, and let's just console.log the input, the lat input, and the long input. Just make sure that's all working. So we'll go back to our actualization here. Refresh the page. And there we go. We got our input, and our required here. Good. So these are all working. Now we're going to write some JavaScript for Google. So first thing we'll say, if there is no input, return. And what that will do is skip this function from running if there is no input on the page. So a bunch of different ways you could do that, but that's a nice simple one to skip that function from running if there's no address on the actual page. Then first we need the drop down, and this is part of the Google Maps autocomplete API. So I've already loaded up. If you view source on this sucker right here, you will see like Google. You'll see that we've already loaded in Google Maps with the API key there. So we'll say const drop down equals new google.maps.places.autocomplete, capital A, and then you give it an input value. Good. So just that alone, if we refresh this and we let's go to add a new one actually. Now, if I were to type in here like Paris, it will automatically start to autocomplete it. So just with that one line of code, we now have autocomplete showing up on that. But that doesn't give us all that much because we need to populate the lat and long. So we'll take this drop down and we'll add listener. An add listener is a Google Maps way to add an event listener. We listen for the event called place_changed. And when that happens, we're going to run a little arrow function here. And we'll say const place equals drop down. So that's the actual input dot get place. And let's just console log palace place. Let's console log the place here and see what we've got. So open up your dev tools here. I'm going to bring that sucker on the bottom, give it a refresh, and let's type in Paris, hit enter. And you see when I hit enter, it will automatically give us this object here with address components, all of the different pieces of the actual address. It gives us some photos of Paris. It gives us some HTML attribute. It gives us the geometry. It gives us the types. It's the locality and political. Everything you could possibly ever want. It will format the address as well in HTML. So what we do need is if we open up the geometry and we open up, where did that go? There we go, geometry.location.lat, and that's a function that will give us the actual lat as well as the long. So here's what we do. We say lat input dot value equals place dot geometry dot location dot lat, and you can just duplicate that and change out the LNG with the LNG. And then if we then refresh this page, and you'll notice every time we take a save, your Webpack bundle, or if I clear this out, give us a save, you notice that Webpack, oh, it didn't change anything. If you change something and give it a save, you'll notice that Webpack will rebundle it for us. You actually have to make a significant change in order for it to trigger a change. It won't trigger on something like a semicolon. There we go. Put it back in, give it a save. It will regenerate our app.bundle.js file for us, which is great. We refresh this. Now, if I type in Paris, select one of them, it's going to automatically populate the long and the lat. Again, let me do Hamilton, Ontario. It will automatically populate the lat and long. Ooh, what happened there? So Hamilton. Okay. And then I type in Paris and hit enter. And it actually refreshes the page. Why? Because what's happening here is we're typing in Paris and hitting enter. And by hitting enter, we're doing two things. We're confirming the autocomplete, but then we're also submitting the entire form, because by hitting enter in one of these inputs here, it will cause the form to actually submit. So we can quickly fix that. Go right below this drop down here, and we'll say if someone hits enter on the address field, don't submit the form. So we'll take our input, which is the address field, and we'll say dot on, because we have on, because normally it's dot add event listener, but we can do input dot on because we are using bling.js. So on, key down, and then there's an event, and we'll say if e.keycode is equal to 13. Why? Because keycode.info, this is if you hit enter, 13 is the key code for enter. Escape 27, you get the point. So if e.keycode equals 13, we're going to say e.prevent default, and that will stop the regular, which is submitting the actual form. So give that a save. Let's double check that now. We'll go back to our store here, type in Paris, hit enter. Type in Hamilton, hit enter. You'll see that it's not submitting the form now. It's just confirming the autocomplete that we have there. Good. So that is the autocomplete for Google. We are going to come back to Google Maps when we actually start A, plotting it on a map, and B, showing a map on the single store pages.